Investigation that has stunned the entertainment world. Phil Hartman, who gained fame on Saturday Night Live, was found shot in his home, apparently killed by his wife, who then committed.
Officers heard a gunshot in the master bedroom. There they discovered comedian Phil Hartman dead.
At 3:00 a.m. in the upscale neighborhood of Encino, California, the comedy world changed forever.
I know she was upset with Phil on one, maybe two occasions where he would be doing a part, The Simpsons or news radio. I think everyone was in shock in the family, and I cannot imagine why she would do that.
There were no warning signs for the public, no tabloid scandals, and no headlines suggesting that Phil Hartman, the most dependable man in Hollywood, was in danger. But while Phil slept in his master bedroom, the private instability of his marriage finally collided with his public success in the most violent way possible. It was a cold, abrupt end to a life defined by making people laugh. This is the tragic and shocking passing of Phil and eventually his wife. 2 deaths in one early morning. The morning of May 28, 1998, began like any other quiet Thursday in the affluent suburbs of Encino, but by dawn, the Hartman residence at 5065 Encino Avenue would become the site of the most shocking self-harm in the history of American comedy. To understand the gravity of this night, you have to look at the state of the Hartman household. On the surface, it was a multi-million-dollar picture of success. Inside, it was a powder keg of resentment and chemical instability. Bryn Hartman had been struggling with her sobriety for years, and that evening the seal finally broke. She had been out at a local Italian restaurant, Brio, having drinks with a friend, Christine Zander. While the evening started out somewhat normally, Bryn was reportedly agitated. She was consuming alcohol while on a prescription of Zoloft, a combination that medical experts later suggested could lead to extreme emotional volatility and violent outbursts. When Bryn returned home that night, she and Phil entered into a confrontation that had become a wearying routine in their marriage. Phil, known for his Mr. Nice Guy persona, was not a fighter. His defense mechanism was emotional withdrawal. He hated conflict so much that his standard response to Bryn's frequent substance-fueled rages was to simply go to sleep and wait for her to sober up. During this final argument, Phil reportedly gave her an ultimatum. If she didn't get off the substances and get her life together, he was leaving her and taking the kids. He then retired to the master bedroom, climbed into bed, and fell into a deep sleep. He likely thought he was protecting himself by ending the conversation. In reality, he was leaving himself completely vulnerable to a woman who had lost her grip on reality. Somewhere between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., Bryn entered the master bedroom. She wasn't there to talk or apologize. She was carrying a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun. While Phil lay on his side, completely unconscious and oblivious to the danger, Bryn opened fire. She shot him 3 times at point-blank range. The first shot hit him in the forearm and entered his chest. The second struck him in the neck. The third was a fatal shot to the head. Phil Hartman, the man who provided the voice for dozens of characters that defined a generation, never even had the chance to wake up. He died instantly in his own bed, surrounded by the comforts of the life he had worked 20 years to build. What happened next was a surreal, disjointed sequence of events that highlighted Bryn's complete mental break. She didn't call the police. She didn't try to hide the body. Instead, she drove to the home of her longtime friend, Ron Douglas. When she arrived at his door, she was covered in blood and hysterical, confessing that she had killed Phil. Douglas, who knew Bryn was prone to dramatic episodes and was clearly under the influence of something, didn't believe her. He thought she had perhaps gotten into a physical fight or was hallucinating. He gave her water and tried to calm her down, but when she produced the killing weapon from her purse, the situation shifted from a bad trip to a horrific reality. Douglas drove Bryn back to the Hartman house in his own car, hoping against hope that she was exaggerating. When they entered the master bedroom and he saw Phil's body slumped on the bed, the true weight of the tragedy hit. Douglas immediately called 911 at 6:20 a.m. When the LAPD arrived, they found a scene that felt like a movie set, gone wrong. The officers' immediate priority wasn't the crime scene, it was the two small children, Sean and Bergen, who were still in the house. As the sun began to rise, officers frantically moved to evacuate the children. Sean, the 9-year-old, was seen by neighbors being led out of the house with his hands over his ears. He had heard the noises, but he hadn't yet processed that his life had changed forever. As the police were leading the children down the driveway, the situation took its final tragic turn. Bryn, realizing the police were there and that there was no way out, retreated back into the master bedroom. She barricaded the door and sat on the bed next to her husband's body. While the police were still on the premises, a single, muffled gunshot echoed through the house. By the time the SWAT team breached the bedroom door, it was too late. Bryn had used a different gun, a .357 Magnum, to take her own life. The two bodies lay side by side on the bed, ending a decade-long marriage in a final bloody stalemate. The news broke shortly after. Within hours, news helicopters were circling the Encino estate, and the world watched in real time as the bodies were wheeled out in black bags. There was no precedent for this in the comedy community. People were used to hearing about stars overdosing in hotels or crashing cars. But the idea of the glue, the man who was supposed to be the most stable person in the room, being killed in his sleep by his wife, was a trauma the industry wasn't prepared to handle. But how did a couple that seemed to have everything reach such a violent breaking point? A marriage in the shadows. To the outside world, Phil and Bryn Hartman were a Hollywood success story. They lived in a $1.5 million estate, had 2 beautiful children, and Phil's career was on an astronomical upward trajectory. But behind the gates of their Encino home, the marriage was a complex web of insecurity, resentment, and a devastating power imbalance. Phil was a man who craved peace, while Bryn was a woman haunted by her own perceived failures. This is the beginning of the deep-seated issues that turned their union into a ticking time bomb. Phil Hartman was 40 years old when he married Bryn Omdahl in 1987. It was his 3rd marriage, and friends noted that Phil seemed determined to make this one work. He was a man who drifted through life with a certain emotional detachment, a trait that made him a brilliant actor but a difficult partner. His previous wives described him as hermetically sealed, a man who lived largely inside his own head. When he met Bryn, a former model and aspiring actress from Minnesota, he was captivated by her beauty and her vibrant, albeit intense, personality. She was 28, ambitious, and looking for a way into the Hollywood elite. In the beginning, they seemed to balance each other out, his stoicism acting as a tether to her high-energy spirit. However, as Phil's fame grew, the cracks in the foundation began to widen. Phil was the glue of Saturday Night Live, a man whose face was on every television screen in America. Bryn, meanwhile, was struggling. She had changed her name from Vicky Jo to Bryn to sound more Hollywood, but the roles weren't coming. She felt increasingly like a trophy wife, secondary character in the Phil Hartman show. This professional jealousy wasn't just a minor annoyance, it was a core part of her identity crisis. She underwent several plastic surgeries in an attempt to maintain her youthful looks and boost her confidence, but it did little to soothe her growing resentment. She wanted to be a star in her own right, but she was living in the shadow of a giant. This insecurity was exacerbated by Bryn's history of substance abuse. She had struggled with substances and alcohol since before meeting Phil, and while she had periods of sobriety, the pressure of her life in Encino often triggered relapses. Phil's reaction to these relapses was part of the problem. He wasn't an enforcer or an interventionist, he was a conflict avoider. When Bryn would spiral into a rage or start using again, Phil would mentally check out. He would retreat to his man cave or simply go to sleep, leaving Bryn to stew in her own misery. This emotional abandonment, while meant to de-escalate, often had the opposite effect, making Bryn feel even more invisible and desperate for a reaction, any reaction, from her husband. The couple's social circle saw the warning signs, though few realized how dangerous the situation had become. There were stories of Bryn sending threatening letters to Phil's second wife, Lisa Strain, warned her to stay away from her man. Lisa later remarked that Phil's emotional distance drove women crazy. They would scream at him just to see if he was capable of feeling anything, but he would just sit there, calm and detached. This passive-aggressive piece was a nightmare for someone as volatile as Bryn. She needed a partner who would engage with her, but Phil had built a wall that no amount of screaming could penetrate. By 1998, the situation had reached a fever pitch. Bryn was back on substances, and she had started taking Zoloft for her depression. The combination of the antidepressant and alcohol is often cited by those close to the family as the final straw. It created a chemical cocktail that amplified her paranoia and aggression. Phil, finally pushed to his limit, began talking about divorce. For Bryn, the threat of losing Phil wasn't just about losing her husband. It was about losing her status, her lifestyle, and the only person who anchored her to the world she so desperately wanted to belong to. She felt trapped, and in her distorted reality, the only way out was to destroy the source of her pain. Their marriage was a classic Hollywood tragedy. A man who gave everything to his audience but had nothing left for his wife, and a woman who wanted the world but couldn't find her place in it. They were two people moving in opposite directions, Phil toward legendary status, and Bryn toward a total breakdown of the self. The violence of that May morning wasn't a random act of madness. It was the final, tragic explosion of a decade of silence, secrets, and a profound lack of communication. While the house in Encino was falling apart, the rest of the world only saw the man who made them laugh every Saturday night. The SNL years. To understand why the tragedy felt like a hole being ripped through the center of pop culture, you have to understand exactly what Phil Hartman meant to Saturday Night Live. He arrived at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in 1986, a time when the show was in a state of absolute crisis. Lorne Michaels had recently returned to a sinking ship, and the previous season had been a critical disaster. Hartman, along with a fresh-faced cast that included Dana Carvey, Kevin Nealon, and Jan Hooks, didn't just save the show, they ushered in a golden era. But while Carvey was the breakout superstar with flamboyant characters like the Church Lady, Phil became something far more essential. He became the glue. The nickname wasn't just a casual compliment. It was a job description. In the high-stakes, caffeine-fueled environment of SNL, where egos are massive and live television creates a constant state of panic, Phil was the stabilizer. He was the performer who could hold a sketch together when a guest host forgot their lines or when a prop failed to trigger. He had a preternatural ability to play the straight man with such conviction that the absurdity around him became 10 times funnier. Whether he was playing a frustrated father, a shady lawyer, or a robotic news anchor, Phil grounded the reality of the scene. His castmates often joked that if you were in a sketch with Phil, you couldn't fail, because he was doing enough heavy lifting for everyone on stage. His range was, quite frankly, terrifying to other actors. Most comedians have one or two gears, but Phil seemed to have an infinite gearbox. Think about his impression of Bill Clinton. Before Phil, Clinton was often portrayed as a soft, perhaps slightly bumbling figure. Phil reimagined him as the ultimate alpha consumer, a man who could explain complex healthcare policy while unashamedly eating a stranger's McDonald's fries. It wasn't just a caricature, it was a definitive take that influenced how the public perceived the president. Then, in the very next sketch, he could pivot to Frank Sinatra, portraying the legendary singer as a menacing, tough-talk host of the Sinatra group who treated his guests like dirt. The transition was seamless. Perhaps his most surreal and beloved creation was the unfrozen caveman lawyer, Key-Rock. The premise was thin. A prehistoric man is thawed out by scientists and becomes a high-powered personal injury attorney. But Phil played it with such a specific, smarmy sincerity constantly claiming to be frightened and confused by the modern world's little glowing boxes, that it became a masterclass in comedic timing. He understood that the secret to great comedy wasn't in the joke itself, but in the commitment to the character's reality. He never winked at the camera. He never let the audience see Phil. They only saw the smooth-talking, platform shoe-wearing caveman. Behind the scenes, Phil was the consummate professional, often serving as a mentor to the younger, more volatile stars like Chris Farley and Adam Sandler. While the younger guys were throwing furniture and living the rock star lifestyle, Phil was in his office, meticulously working on his scripts or drawing. He was a trained graphic designer, having famously designed the logo for Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and he approached comedy with the same precision he used for art. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave. This work ethic earned him an Emmy Award for writing in 1989, a testament to the fact that his brain was just as sharp as his voice. However, being the glue came with a hidden cost. Because he was so reliable and so good at supporting others, he was often overlooked for the leading man roles that went to his flashier colleagues. Phil didn't seem to mind, at least not publicly. He once famously said that he wasn't a star, but a utility player. He took pride in being the man who could do anything, the actor's actor. But as he entered his 8th and final season in 1994, the landscape of the show was shifting toward bad boy comedy. The subtle, character-driven work Phil excelled at was being replaced by louder, broader humor. It was time for him to move on, to see if the utility player could finally carry a show of his own. He left SNL with a record-setting performance count and a legacy that prompted the show to air a special tribute titled The Best of Phil Hartman. When he walked out of the doors of Studio 8H for the last time, he was a legend in the industry, even if the average person on the street still referred to him as that guy from that thing. He was ready for his next act, unaware that his greatest professional successes were still ahead of him, and his greatest personal tragedy was closing in. As SNL came to an end, Phil transitioned into the roles that would cement him as a household voice, if not always a household name. Voice of a generation and the news radio era. If Saturday Night Live was where Phil Hartman proved he was the most versatile man in show business, the mid to late 90s was the period where he became an inescapable part of the American subconscious. This era was defined by two massive pillars: his work on The Simpsons and his starring role in the NBC sitcom News Radio. It was during this time that Phil moved from being a utility player to a performer who could elevate an entire franchise just by showing up to a table read. He was no longer just the guy holding the sketches together, he was the guy the audience was waiting to see. Nowhere was his impact felt more deeply than in the town of Springfield. On The Simpsons, Phil voiced two of the most iconic recurring characters in animation history: the D-list actor Troy McClure and the bottom-feeding lawyer Lionel Hutz. These characters were designed to be shallow, hack archetypes, but Phil gave them a bizarrely endearing humanity. As Troy McClure, Phil delivered the famous catchphrase, "Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from such films as," with a specific blend of desperate bravado and plastic Hollywood charm. He understood that McClure wasn't just a failed actor, he was a man perpetually performing for an audience that wasn't there. Similarly, his Lionel Hutz was a masterclass in comedic ineptitude, a lawyer so bad at his job that he once argued in court that hearsay was a form of hearsay and therefore admissible. The writers of The Simpsons often remarked that they could give Phil the thinnest, driest lines, and he would return them with a delivery so funny they'd have to rewrite the scene to make it longer. He was so vital to the show's texture that after his death, the producers made the heavy decision to retire his characters entirely. They didn't feel it was right to recast him. The characters belonged to Phil, and without his specific, smarmy yet vulnerable cadence, they simply wouldn't exist. His work on the show turned him into the voice of a generation for millions of kids and adults who grew up with the golden age of Springfield. While his voice was conquering animation, Phil was finally getting his chance to lead a live-action ensemble in news radio. As Bill McNeil, the pompous, old-school radio news anchor, Phil created a character that was essentially a love letter to his own everyman persona. Bill McNeil was arrogant, out of touch, and frequently the antagonist of the office. Yet Phil played him with such undeniable charisma that the audience couldn't help but root for him. It was on this set, however, that the professional world collided with his personal life in a way that would later become a subject of intense scrutiny. The cast was close-knit, but there was a notable friction between Phil and castmate Andy Dick. Phil was the disciplined veteran, while Dick was the unpredictable wild card. This tension would eventually form the basis of a bitter feud that lasted long after Phil was gone. Beyond the small screen, Phil was beginning to break into the world of major motion pictures. He was the perfect foil for Arnold Schwarzenegger in Jingle All the Way, playing the perfect neighbor Ted who was secretly trying to steal Arnold's wife. He was also a standout in Small Soldiers and Sergeant Bilko. Hollywood was starting to realize that if you needed a character who was simultaneously charming and untrustworthy, the smarmy but likable guy, Phil Hartman, was the only person to call. He was building a massive resume, a massive fortune, and a massive legacy. To the public, he was at the top of the mountain. He was wealthy, respected, and seemingly untouchable. But the irony of this era was that as his professional life became louder and more successful, his home life was becoming quieter and more dangerous. He was spending more time at the studio to avoid the chaos of his house, a decision that inadvertently fueled Bryn's feeling of abandonment. Phil was winning the world, but he was losing the battle at home, and the everyman was about to face a tragedy that no amount of talent could script his way out of. With his career at an all-time high, his sudden absence felt like a physical blow to the industry. The ripple effect. The death of Phil Hartman didn't just leave a hole in a few television schedules, it shattered the morale of an entire industry. In the days following the self-harm, the show-must-go-on mentality of Hollywood was put to its ultimate test. For the creators of The Simpsons, the loss was insurmountable. Matt Groening and the production team quickly decided that Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz would never be voiced by anyone else. They were retired immediately, a rare move in animation where characters are usually considered intellectual property that outlives their actors. This decision effectively froze a part of Springfield in time, serving as a permanent, silent tribute to the man who made those characters breathe. On the set of News Radio, the atmosphere was even more somber. The show had to address the loss of its central star, while the cast was still reeling from the trauma. The Season 5 premiere, Bill Moves On, is widely considered one of the most heartbreaking episodes of any sitcom ever produced. The characters gather to read letters left behind by Bill McNeil, and the tears seen on screen weren't scripted acting. They were the genuine grief of a cast that had lost their anchor. The show attempted to continue with Jon Lovitz, Phil's close friend, joining the cast to fill the void, but the chemistry had fundamentally altered. News Radio lasted only one more season, proving that Phil truly was the glue that held even the most successful projects together. However, as the formal tributes faded, a much darker narrative began to emerge within the comedy community, a narrative of blame and bitter resentment. The central figure in this storm was Jon Lovitz, who directed his grief and fury toward castmate Andy Dick. The story, which has since become a piece of grim Hollywood legend, alleges that Dick had given Bryn Hartman substances at a Christmas party at the Hartmans' home just months before the killing. Bryn had been sober for 10 years prior to that night. Lovitz, and many others, believed that this relapse was the direct catalyst for the downward spiral that ended in Phil's death. The tension between Lovitz and Dick boiled over years later in 2007 at the Laugh Factory in West Hollywood. According to witnesses, after Dick allegedly made a comment to Lovitz about putting the Phil Hartman hex on him, Lovitz physically confronted him, reportedly smashing Dick's head into the bar. It was a visceral explosion of a decade's worth of repressed anger. While the blame for a self-harm is never simple, The feud highlighted the deep fracture Phil's death left in the tight-knit world of 90s comedy. It turned a community of jokesters into a group of mourning, finger-pointing survivors. Amidst the industry infighting, there were two small children left behind. Sean and Bergen Hartman were the primary concern for the family in the wake of the tragedy. In an incredible act of protection, Phil's brother, John Hartman, and Bryn's sister, Catherine Omdahl, coordinated to shield the children from the media circus. The kids were moved to the Midwest to live with their aunt and uncle, where they were raised under a different last name to allow them a semblance of a normal childhood. They were kept away from the spotlight, the tabloids, and the morbid curiosity of the public. Today, Sean and Bergen have emerged as resilient adults. Bergen, in particular, has been open on social media about her journey with sobriety and her love for her parents, often posting tributes to Phil on Father's Day. The fact that they were able to build healthy, private lives is perhaps the only silver lining in a story defined by darkness. They inherited Phil's estate, but more importantly, they inherited the goodwill of an industry that still speaks of their father with a reverence usually reserved for the divine. The legacy of the Hartman family is no longer just about the tragedy in Encino. It is about the quiet strength of the two people who survived it. In the end, we're left with a legacy that is half brilliance and half heartbreak. The man behind the mask. Phil Hartman was a man who spent his life becoming other people. He was a chameleon, a vocal shapeshifter who could inhabit the skin of a president, a caveman, or a cartoon lawyer with equal ease. But the tragedy of his death lies in the fact that, for all his fame, the real Phil Hartman remained a mystery to almost everyone who knew him. He was a man who lived for the bit, a professional who used his talent as a shield against the messy, unpredictable nature of real life. He was conflict-averse to a fault, a trait that made him a dream to work with, but a difficult man to truly reach in a marriage. The nice guy paradox of Phil Hartman is a cautionary tale for the ages. It suggests that even the most stable, reliable person in the room can be harboring a private life that is fundamentally unsustainable. Phil didn't die because of a scandal or a reckless lifestyle. He died because he was trying to maintain a sense of order in a situation that had become chaotic beyond repair. He was the glue who finally found a crack he couldn't fill. His death was a stark reminder that behind the laughter and the polished performances of Hollywood, there are human beings struggling with very real, very dark demons. As we look back on his body of work, it's impossible not to feel a sense of what if. If he had lived, Phil Hartman would likely be the elder statesman of comedy today, probably with an Oscar on his shelf, or a long-running prestige drama under his belt. He was just getting started. But even with a career cut short, his impact is undeniable. You can hear his influence in every voice actor who tackles a smarmy character, and you can see his DNA in every straight man who anchors a sketch on SNL. He set the standard for what it means to be a professional in a business that is often anything but. Phil should be remembered for the joy he brought to millions, for the voices that still echo in our favorite episodes, and for the sheer, unadulterated talent he brought to the screen every single time the red light went on. He was a man of 1,000 voices, and though he was silenced far too soon, the laughter he created remains immortal. He was, and will always be, the greatest utility player the game has ever seen. A man who made everyone else look better, even when things were falling apart behind the scenes. If you liked this deep dive, consider subscribing to the channel for future uploads. Thanks for watching.